We're speaking with Patricia McDermott, Professor of Women's Studies and Socio-Legal Studies at York University, and the playwright of Life on the Line, Women Strike at Eatons of 1984-85. About the Eaton strike and its significance to the labor movement. What was it about?
The Eaton strike was probably the most important strike around women's issues in Canada, certainly in the contemporary time. It was a strike, a very basic recognition strike. So the union, it did get recognized, I shouldn't quite say that, but it was a strike about getting a first contract. So I think 6 or 7 units, some were mail order, in Toronto and in southern Ontario, went out all at once, which was amazing. So you had 6 Eaton stores struck at one time. It involved 1,500 women, and they're mostly women. I say that because you'll see if you look at a store, it's still the same. Mm-hmm. Most of the men are in commission sales, and they make a lot more money. So it was really about the non-commissioned, on-the-floor retail workers in Eatons, and it's the first time we ever saw a big strike at a huge employer. At the time, Eatons was one of the biggest employers in Canada, hundreds of stores across the country. It was the first time that women came out as kind of in a united women's strike. It caught on. The labor movement supported it. The women's movement supported it, and that's the first time that came together. In 1985, the Women's Day March, the International Women's Day March, was led by the Eaton strikers, and that's never happened before, where the labor movement and the women's movement came together around a big issue. Mm-hmm. And I guess it's also important because it revealed to the bishops of Canada and the United Church and all kinds of organizations how little money these women made. So it was a very big deal. There was a national boycott organized by the union involved and other unions. It went across the country, and it's as important in Vancouver as it is in Halifax. At the time, it got literally hundreds of press releases over the 6-month period that they were on. It's also a very long strike.
It lasted how long?
6 months.
6 months.
It could have lasted longer, but the legislation that we were working with, you don't get your job back after 6 months.
And what were they asking for exactly?
Basic contract for most of the strike. Just they wanted a little bit of pension increase, which they got none. They wanted a modest wage increases, and basically what you get with a union, grievance arbitration, and so it's just a simple strike.
And was it they already were unionized at that point?
No,
okay.
No, they weren't. They had been unionized in the 40s, which made it a very interesting, historically, a strike that, because a huge drive in the 40s had failed. Okay. So it was kind of, 48 years later, we're at it again. So okay. Yeah, it's important. Many things. I just want to throw in also, a lot of people supported the strike, like actors and musicians. We had a huge concert at Massey Hall in Toronto, and Margaret Atwood and all kinds of performers were there, Eric Peterson, and so it was culturally interesting too.
What year was that when they all came in?
85. Okay. The strike started in 84, November, and ended in late May 85.
What was the significance of that strike on the labor movement, women's rights, labor movement, all of that? What was the significance?
I think it's the first time in Canadian labor history that gender issues became a focus for the labor movement. So that a lot of the unions that were, frankly, we still see male culture, male-dominated unions, they didn't see the issues that women have in the workplace as, I think, as serious.
Mm-hmm.
They also didn't understand that the strikes that they would be having were going to be quite different than male strikes. And that's a lot in that I did research on, where the women would talk about, this isn't a steel plant, this isn't an auto plant. We're dealing with our customers, our clients. We want to have them think of us well after the strike. And so it was a completely different way. They used their sort of relationship with the public as workers that serve the public in the strike, to a lot of humor. And so I think it was important for seeing the strike as with women's tactics, also service sector tactics in the private sector. We've had service sector strikes, but this was the first time it was a private sector, a big important strike involving mostly women.
Okay. And they used a lot of creative tactics, right? You were mentioning that, you sort of alluded to that, like humor and song and different things. What?
Well, there were, throughout the strike, a lot of events. So we had a baby shower, for example, for a woman at the Eatons young store that was there. And so it was a mass baby shower on a corner. They, at Shoppers World, had Eatons on Create the Sun event at the store. So they had the strikers on Create the Sun. And they were out there in February, below zero weather, and a blizzard actually, with lawn chairs and music. I think it was a strike where they were very creative about how to convince the public of their plight, and they did very well. They got most people in Canada on their side, and most, I mentioned the churches, the women's movement, and really the whole labor movement, from the steel workers, auto workers, right through to the public sector unions. They were supporting the strike, very popular strike.
How successful was it? What did they end up with?
They ended up with a union. Interestingly, Eatons decided to take back to the table and settle up after a big Massey Hall concert that I mentioned. So there might have been some kind of pressure on the Eaton family because of the popularity of the strike, especially Catholic Bishops' Conference and the Anglican Church, etc. So they came back basically with the same contract, and because the 6-month deadline was approaching, the union took it. So they got a contract, they got a grievance process, but they didn't get much else actually.
Really?
Other than, historically, for Canadians in Ontario, they got under the Peterson-Ray Accord at the time when they came into provincial power, they got first contract legislation, so that what the Labour Board would do after this, when they got this legislation, would simply give first-time striking people to get their union recognized and to get a first contract in place. They would give them a basic first contract, so you wouldn't have to strike over it.
Okay.
That got taken away, I should mention, by Harris.
Oh, it did?
But it was great while it lasted.
While it lasted.
Well, to stay on strike for 6 months, it does become part of your life and routine. And some had trailers out in Bramalea. They had a trailer where they did a lot of cooking. And that became a life. They say, what are we having for lunch? So it's because it's a women running a strike. It was very different, I think, than a lot of male strikes. I totally support those, but it had a different culture, if you will. Yeah. And because they were dealing directly with people that knew them often, and they knew they had a lot of support too from their own customers who didn't shop. The boycott, actually after 6 months across Canada, the boycott started to set in, and some people would tell you that the eventual demise of Eatons actually started with the strike. It started with disorganization of some stores that were key, and people turning against the brand of Eatons, and a lot of people had, across Canada, boycott Eatons signs in their windows for years, actually, and just, it started to reduce their business, which might have been a turning point.
So, were you actually at the strike itself? What brought you to the strike?
Oh, yes. I was at the strike almost every day, because the group of us that I mentioned,
what do they call it?
The Women's Strike Support Coalition, we would go around and support strikes.
Okay.
Get to know the strikers, bring coffee, help publicize their strikes. So this one was a high moment for us. And so I got to know the strikers at about 4 stores, Shoppers World, Eglinton, Yonge, and when you go out and actually picket for an hour or so, and then you're organizing events, you want people to talk at it, and we're organizing this concert, and so I got to know them, and I was then got easy access, as we'd say, to get in and talk to them later in their homes about the strike. I taped interviews for a couple of hours, so I have piles of transcripts about the strike.
From the strikers.
And the play, I should mention, is based all on transcripts. That's what's interesting for the historians, that these words were actually spoken by all of the strikers about the strike after it was over.
So you base the plays literally on the transcripts?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. And how many times has the play been performed already?
It's about 8 times now, and there are a few more venues. Things like the Ontario Public Service Employees Union Women's Conference they have a big conference, and so the play is going to be there. It's been at May Works. It was at Ryerson University's Social Justice Week and the Berkshire. So it was at a union called Unifor, biggest union in Canada. So it was up at Port Elgin at their organizers conference. So it sort of moves around in that venue. It's directly targeted at the people that it's kind of an inspirational play, if I must say myself. So I think it's used to sort of inspire people that we can get out and organize today, because this is what we need with the growth of precarious work. We need to get people in unions.
So, and just a little bit about you then. You're a professor
of women's studies and socio-legal studies.
Okay.
So I look at gender and the law together.
So what inspired you initially to become so interested in strikes and labor movement?
That goes way back. I've always been what we call a union maid. I mean, for sure. Even in high school, I worked at a company called Bix Pickles. Years ago, I was a teenager. There was a strike. And my parents kind of said, well, they're on strike, but you shouldn't go into work. And I just got a kind of social justice training, I think, as a young person, and that carried right through to university and through my academic career. So when they asked us to write this, I thought, well, we'll have a few vignettes, scenes, and then it just got going, and then I wanted to tell the whole story of the play. It's a little over an hour long, and it's in 5 scenes, and it kind of starts with the organizing drive of a group of women who have never even thought of a union and were afraid of unions, and their husband said, you're not going to the organizing meeting, and right through to the 6 months where they ended up the last day of the strike. So it's the emotions and how their families responded, and mostly how they changed, what they did change, these women on strike. If they stayed out for the full, even 3 or 4 months, but the 6 months, their lives, they said, were totally transformed by being on strike. I think to watch women there were housewives who had often a part-time, but they were the full-time 8 to 3 shift, and they would go home because their children were coming home from school. So this group of women saw themselves as housewives mostly, who worked at Eaton's.
Right.
They did extremely good work at Eaton's in terms of, if you talk to them about what they did, they really organized Eaton. So they were proud of their work. They did very important work for the company, but they knew they got paid very little. So they became aware of their position in the world. They became aware of politics, because all the politicians were coming to the line trying to get photo ops with them. And so they understood that, and they started to read the newspapers, and all of them, because we were heading into an election, they were all screaming and yelling with people at the door, like when the Tories would come saying, you're not doing anything for us. And so they became very politically aware. Right. And also it changed their family dynamics. Their husbands had to cater to them actually through the strike and support them, which was unusual. And their children, they told their children about strike. So they became quite militant actually after being on strike for 6 months, dealing with the public and the cars going by. And so that's for me, the transformation. I mean, I must say I like strikes anyway, but I think going into strikes and actually experiencing standing up for your rights, which I think is a human rights issue, it's very transformative. It really makes you confirmed in your beliefs that what you're doing is right and that you should stand up for yourself. And that's the life transforming. They all said, my eyes were opened, you know, so that's the exciting part of it.
And, you know, moving forward, this is, how many, 30 years ago now? It's a long time ago.
85?
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah.
Where are we now in terms of any new developments on the stage of the labor movement, whether it's with retail, precarious jobs, women's movement? That seems to be a big focus of yours. So anything of recent that you wanted to mention that has had impact as well in the movement?
Well, the most exciting thing happening, I think, is what started as something called the 15 movement, or Fight for 15 a union called the SEIU, the Service Employees International Union, started, I think it was in New York City, a kind of campaign to get $15 for fast food workers. I would say that has spread like wildfire. You'll see protests with just 15, and it's condensed the idea that precarious, the most vulnerable workers in Canada and in North America and likely in the world, should be given a wage they can live on. And in most cities in North America, you can get by on $15 an hour. It's transformed a little bit into something called the living wage movement, and that's another very exciting movement and starting to kind of take off, where everyone in these towns and cities across Canada and the States will actually say, what does it take for a person or a family of four to live in this city without being humiliated? What decent housing, basic food, transportation. So those movements, because of the incredible increase in precarity and precarious work, it's kind of a movement that just says, okay, let's solve this immediately with basic wages. And interestingly, which is very exciting, it doesn't necessarily involve unions at the moment. The SEIU started with the union movement, but they funded centers that actually make living wage and the Fight for 15 mass movements, in the sense that you can just fight for that and your employer may say yes, like Costco, yes, Walmart, yes. So you haven't had to go through the torture in some ways of getting a union in there. But I think it's the first step.
Any of the court cases coming about these days that you wanted to mention that you're focusing on, anything that's important?
From the Supreme Court of Canada, the most exciting cases that have come out in January 2015 is a set of cases. They often call these trilogies. And the last case of the trilogy with Meredith and Mounted Police is a case called the Saskatchewan Federation of Labor. That case has really said to Canadians, you have the right to strike. Just at the moment, in the context of industrial relations, although people are trying to push the parameters of that. But if you're in a workplace, you have the right to, and you're in a union, you have the right to strike. We've never really seen that so clearly outlined by the Supreme Court of Canada. It affects back to work legislation. It says to all the governments in Canada, look, if you have back to work legislation in your pocket as soon as a group of people go out on strike, you're going to have to redraft that and think about how you take away the right to strike from people, because it's now a human right, it's a charter right, and it's clear. We've never had it so clearly set out by the Supreme Court. Interestingly, it reverses 28 years of jurisprudence going the other way, saying that the Section 2D of the Charter does not support the right to strike. It historically in '87 was seen as an individual's right, and it wasn't a collective right. Now with the Saskatchewan Federation of Labor, it is a collective right, an individual right, it's just a right under the Charter. That is, in terms of labor law, extremely exciting, and it opens a lot of doors to other issues around worker activity. With the growth of such large numbers of people in what we call precarity, the precarious work, actually a term called the precariat, they need unions, they need protection, they need basic rights, so that I think it's a very exciting time because people are starting to think about, yes, you know, a young person who's 27 working at McDonald's has to live. So the growth of the precarious labor market is huge. I mean, it's grown 5 times, and since '97 the number of people living precariously and low wages has grown 5 times. It's considered the biggest sort of issue economically in Canada.